Why do people buy into narratives? I have approximately 1,000 things to say about this subject. I'll try and keep this walk and talk to just a few of them. This is a subject that I first began to explore at depth when I hosted Matthias Desmet on the Pandemic podcast over a year ago. By far our most popular, most watched, most downloaded episode. It's been translated into multiple languages. It's been watched by millions of people around the world. And even to this day, we get thousands of views every week of the original conversation with Matthias, where we talked about why people were still buying into the COVID narrative at the time. Now, I want to address the question, why do people buy into the narrative? Let me first by saying why I'm doing this video. Tonight I'm joined by David Charalambous, who's another former guest on the Pandemic podcast and the Elevate podcast. He's a behavioural expert, he's a communications expert, spent the last 25 plus years trying to understand why people do what they do, with particular emphasis on communication and influence. He and I are getting together tonight for a live free event at 6:30. So you'll see the link in the comments and in this post about how you can join us. David is obsessed with the question, why do people buy into the narrative? Not only to understand the psychology behind it and how and why it's happening, but more importantly, how we can start to reach people. His brand is reaching people. How we can actually break through the divides and the polarization to have more effective conversations, how we can have engaging debate around rational facts, to get a shared sense of understanding, because realistically and throughout history really, we've created some form of consensus by shared sense making. But we live in a world where shared sense-making is not something that actually occurs, certainly not in the public domain. There is no debate. There is only ideologies and narratives, which is what I'll go on to speak about in a moment. But 6:30 tonight, we'll be together for around about 90 minutes. David has been obsessively researching. He's got all kinds every time I speak to him, he's got so many new insights. So I said, look, David, every time we have a phone call, I just wish we'd have pressed record and captured what you've just shared, because there's always these breaking, just real understandings of the dynamics of human behavior, what's causing it. We're not looking at the mechanical influences such as, I'll go on to talk about mechanical influences in terms of who is determining the narrative and why, but we look at the human response to narratives, and he's trying to understand, the way people process it and communicate. And every time we speak, he's literally got all these new insights and breakthroughs. So I said, look, David, let's just schedule a time to speak. And every time, even when we're talking about, let's just schedule an event, we're like getting into it. I'm like, David, 6:30 Thursday, let's do it. So we're doing it tonight. You can join us for free. It's kind of a taster of the things that we do inside the Elevate network with our members. You can join us at 6:30. And David and I are going to do a regular slot, because he's just, like I said, he's just on a path and just really trying to understand all of this, and he's always got breaking revelations. So you'll see that tonight. That's why I'm recording this video. I wanted to tell you about tonight's event, but I also have 1,000 things, as I said, to say about this subject. So why do people buy into narratives? Goodness me, I mean, this is something that irks me on a daily basis when I reflect back on what we've been through over the last couple of years, and the way how this growing divergence between observable reality and fact, material reality, rational reality, and the portrayal of narratives and stories, ideologies and dogma around the underlying reality. This is something for me just by fortune, I guess, that in February 2020, before COVID really hit the headlines in a major way, my wife and I flew out to Thailand for our honeymoon, and there was this rumblings of this new thing. There was some you could see some of the alarms starting to raise. And it led me to want to understand it. Because I thought, if we're going to go out to Asia and this thing's going to start kicking off and it's going to interrupt our honeymoon, then I'm not going to be all too happy about it. So let's preempt the situation by taking a look at some of the early data. And at that time in February, there were some initial reports from China. There were initial published papers looking at the kind of impact of the early impact of COVID. And it was very clear that this was an age-graduated condition that primarily, when it came to mortality, seriously affected, primarily affected rather, not only the elderly, but those who had pre-existing long-standing conditions, and usually multiple conditions. So I saw that and made some initial assessments. I remember then sitting at Heathrow Airport at the time, reading, people had started wearing masks, and I read this fantastic report, really in-depth report. My poor wife sat there at Heathrow with me engaged in this report from the Civil Aviation Authority, basically explaining why masks had very little to no benefit on a flight when it comes to respiratory illnesses, whether you're talking influenzas, coronaviruses, and so on. And an extensive report that basically invalidated the need for wearing masks. So I was like, okay, fine. And then we got back from our honeymoon. Fortunately, did get to go uninterrupted. Beautiful time, although the obsessive hand washing, we were witnessing it already back in the day at that time. News had obviously travelled to Asia slightly faster than it had to some of the rest of the world. And then I got back to the UK. 1 week later, we're in lockdown, and I remember reading the initial Public Health England report around how cases and hospitalizations and deaths were going to be recorded, and it just blew my mind. I thought there's no chance in any amount of time in the future that we're ever going to be able to properly account for the burden of this particular condition. The way that the game was set up in those initial papers, I call it a game now, but back then, I read this Public Health England report. I thought, surely no medical professional is going to read this and think this makes sense. Surely someone is going to see something here and say this isn't right. We'll never have an appropriate clinical diagnostic method to actually be able to verify whether someone is sick with this new virus or something else, let alone impact on mortality and hospitalization. And that never changed. It never changed. And then the hysteria ramped up and up and up. We're in lockdowns. And for me personally, as someone who I consider to be a rational observer of the world, just reached a bursting point at midway through 2020 where the gap between the observable reality and the noise, the hysteria, the narrative the gap became so grand that I had to say something. But whether it's Brexit, whether it's COVID, whether it's climate change, whether it's Ukraine, or any other recent event in history, we can see now that there are these grand narratives that dominate our airwaves, the screens and the papers. And the question becomes then, how do we discern what is the actual underlying reality as opposed to a story or a narrative or a ideology? And it's fascinating to observe how this trend is growing. I just watched, I don't know if you've seen it, Lizzie and I watched it at the weekend, The Social Dilemma. Much of the content of The Social Dilemma, it was really a conversation around, a documentary rather, around how social media is used to influence people's thoughts, feelings, actions, political views, behaviors, how often they'll use their phone, how often they'll check into the content they consume, how they think, the views that they have. And it's very evident that digital technology can alter the way you see the world, not only alter the way that you currently see the world, but shape the way that you see the world in the future. And all of this is happening unconsciously. People aren't watching their newsfeed on social media or what we buy. Absolutely. Absolutely what we buy. It's all about advertising at the end of the day. Keep you glued to your screen so that you continue to make purchases Why do you think the app is free to the end user? But it's clearly not only influencing how we currently see the world and how we may have historically seen the world, but it's shaping how we'll see the world in the future. So these tools, we had advertising, television advertising, billboards, radio, print. There was all these different ways to influence your behavior, your thoughts, your feelings. But now it's like 24/7 in a way that is truly addictive. People treat their technology like a drug. We're basically addicts, meaning that we are seemingly in the matrix, but most people aren't aware that they're even in the matrix. They're so tapped in to this digital world, and that becomes their reality, that whatever dominant information or story is prevalent within your digital world becomes your dominant worldview. It's become so easy to shape narratives and counter narratives. And let's be real, it's not just dominant mainstream narratives that are shaped and molded and proliferated through these technologies. Counter narratives are deliberately created and infiltrated in order to create division, polarization, divide, because ultimately divide and conquer is what keeps people from clubbing together and challenging the authorities that propagate these things. So we have this problem. So why do people buy into the narrative? Because we're unconscious consumers of content, and content can take a radical different set of forms. But the psychology behind it is fascinating. David will talk about some of that tonight. And there's many examples from the world of advertising. It's all verifiable, observable fact when it comes to how persuasive and influential content can influence the way you see the world. Even what I'm saying now, if you're paying attention and you're listening to what I'm saying, I may be influencing. I'm not deliberately trying to influence you to a point of view. I'm just taking a walk before I get into my next tasks and kind of letting off some steam and telling you about tonight's event. But we need to come back to that place of discernment where we unplug from the digital world and we find ourselves back into conscious awareness if we're really able to observe reality. But more importantly, if we're really able to start to break down the divides amongst people and find solutions. Because let's be clear, we are facing enormous challenges right now. And in order to tackle enormous challenges, we need an extraordinary vision for the future. We need an extraordinary vision for the future of a better world. But that requires us to go above and beyond politics. It requires us to go above and beyond narratives. It requires us to go above and beyond our differences and the things that divide us to a place where we can enter into a creative state of mind to actually tap into the ingenuity that is within all of us as human beings and start to collaborate together onto truly building that extraordinary world that each of us may be able to see in our own minds. But it's incredibly difficult for us to do that whilst we are divided and drawn by grand narratives, and it keeps us separate. It keeps us separate. And we have to transcend that. So why do people buy into narratives? That's a question we're going to address tonight. But I got some theories of my own. And let's be straight about this. Who controls politics right now around the world, particularly in the Western world? No matter what issue you're looking at, whether it's COVID, whether it's the cost of living, whether it's climate, whether it's Ukraine or any other issue, there is a rising anti-government sentiment. And I fully feel that sentiment myself. But deeper than the anti-government sentiment, I actually have a energy around the nature of the systems that underpin government, the political system itself, the economic system itself, really looking at the root causes of the ills and the challenges that we're facing. And it's easy to speak about the challenges, that extraordinary vision of the world that I mentioned. There are some things we can do. We can flip our problems and challenges upside down, look at the reverse of it and see something more beautiful. But to really see a brighter future, we really have to get out of that zone of anxiety and frustration and despair and fear that can come from all of the things that we're witnessing in the world. And quite rightly, people are angry with governments. But really, we have to be clear that politics, media, business, education, healthcare is owned, controlled, and managed by a very small number of corporations and elite individuals. You know, so you can get angry at your government, but the reason we should be angry at our government is for the extent to which they have let big business and big money in the door and made them their partners, their crony partners in everything that's unfolding right now. You could say partners in crime, certainly for some things. Whereas the rest of us, the public, the great majority, the door to us has been closed, and we vote once every 4 years, and we, you know, during the election campaigns, we fall for the same propaganda and manipulation that I've just been talking about that divides us into left and right, one side of the corridor versus the other, and we never get anywhere. Nothing ever changes. And the system does an incredible job of maintaining the status quo. Which is why, when you're angry at your government, as I am, we must be angry for the right reasons, and to recognize that the real way to maintain and preserve and have an opportunity of any form of democracy is to curb the influence of big money, big corporates. But that's a big, big, big challenge. But I tell you this not because I want to go on a rant about the root causes of all things, but, which I do, that's my obsession, my own obsession right now, is understanding the systemic root causes rather than the surface level problems. It's really to recognize where the narratives are coming from and who they are serving. And you'll notice an upward flow of resources with every single crisis, whether it's COVID, whether it's cost of living, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's climate. Notice where the resources continue to flow. And it's really interesting. I was talking to one of my team this morning about who's feeling the current reality the hardest. And when it comes to cost of living, there is a segment of population called the precariat, people in precarious economic and social circumstances. I think it's a derogatory term, but nonetheless, it's a catch-hold summary. And historically, that precariat represented the small group of people who had the lowest disposable resources. But now it's extending significantly into the middle class. And the middle class is not only bending financially, but it's also bending in terms of its influence and status. And when these things happen, you start to see a real shift in the shape of civilization. It becomes almost like an hourglass figure where the middle begins to collapse and the emphasis is put on the extremes. And in those environments, democracy becomes even more unstable, and you risk the possibility of civil unrest, which I believe is something that we are potentially on the cusp of. Kaiser Chiefs have written a song about it. And what role do these grand narratives play, and why do we continue to buy into them, and who do they serve? We must be able to be bold enough and courageous enough to answer these questions, and it takes people getting uncomfortable to look at these things in a way that makes you take stock and think, maybe something isn't right here. Maybe what I'm reading isn't the full truth. And yes, there is a fascinating book called Manufacturing Consent. There was an event in 1988 talking about how consent is manufactured and stories are manufactured in order to keep people suppressed. Yet we are blindly and willfully ignorant. But why? 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 Because we want the quiet life of simplicity. The quiet life of desperation, of quiet desperation, is simpler and easier than what is required to confront the enormity of the challenge in front of us. Therefore, we subject ourselves and segregate ourselves to the lowest common denominator, which keeps us where we are and maintains the status quo. So we have to realize we're entering what is described in academic terms as neo-feudalism. You know, we think we moved away from feudalism, where the age of empires has passed, and now we live in a liberal democracy or a capitalist environment. Well, we may partially have those things, but neo-feudalism means that the means of production are owned and managed by the few corporations, and the rest of us serve those corporations, either with our human resource as employees, or personal services, or simply our attention. And, you know, I'm not going to go down the track of class wars here, but it's very evident that we are entering into this new dimension whereby, people get described as populist or demagogues for pointing out these things. And this isn't about creating a us and them civil war. It's about understanding that we have a duty ourselves to recognize that we are being plagued by these grand narratives, and we must confront the brutal reality of the systemic injustices that are propagated and continued throughout history. And it's the very same people over and over again, through bloodlines, families, systems. Yes, that has increased because of the opportunities that are available to people in the digital age. But the reality is, whilst the corporations have continued to amass power, through global treaties which have enabled trade at scale. Helena Norberg-Hodge talked about that during our recent Q&A. If you haven't seen that, come and join the network, check it out. Really insightful around some of the specific treaties that have caused some of the specific problems that we're facing right now, and who was behind those treaties, and how certain political decisions essentially give away the authority of the state to these actors. And we are left here scratching our heads watching what just happened, mainly because of everything I've just talked about, where we sit along the sidelines as passive observers rather than active participants. So meanwhile, while the mega corporations and the wealthiest few have continued to amass power, what have we done as civilians? We have given our power away by sitting on the sidelines, obediently minding our own business, living the simple life. And don't get me wrong, we all want the simple life. We don't all want a simple life, but we like a sense of ease that comes with a comfortable life. But we got to get uncomfortable if we want to create change. Nothing in history was ever changed by being comfortable. We have to get uncomfortable, and it doesn't take all of us, fortunately, but it will take some of us getting uncomfortable enough to challenge what we see in the world. And beyond just getting uncomfortable and simply trying to point out and tackle the issues that we see, as I spoke about earlier in this video, we need an extraordinary vision for the future, because ultimately, right now, people are feeling down and out. They're feeling depressed, stressed, worn out, anxious, concerned, in fear. It's exactly where people want them to be. And it's exactly the condition that leads people to feeling disempowered, disenfranchised, and unable to tackle not only their own circumstances, let alone the magnitude of the issues that I've been outlining here today. But with a compelling vision, with a sense of courage, with a sense of belief, with a sense of possibility, we can not only dream of a better world, but create one. And it's down to each of us to do that. Everyone's looking around for leaders. People are waiting for the new prime minister. The new prime minister ain't going to solve these problems. People on the left and the right can agree on that. It's one thing that there is agreement on. But it's down to each of us. Everyone's waiting for someone else to come up with a plan. The reality is, if you don't have a plan for your life, someone else will have a plan for you. And Terence McKenna said that. And we've got to come up with our own plan and start dreaming again. This is our time to do so. And by doing so, we create the opportunity to affect the world around us and create our own story. Because that's all this is. It's a story. And if we want to turn the page to a new chapter of this story, then the pen is in our hands to author the new narrative, not only for our own lives, but for the world around us. A narrative that's not yet being created, but one that is unfolding, one that is for us to make real in and manifest in destiny. It is an opportunity that is available to all of us, but most of us cower in the fear of the possibility. It's time to confront that fear and dance with that fear and put it to one side and recognize that when our dreams are grand enough, our fears pale in comparison. So, I didn't talk that much about narratives. There's a lot more I have to say. I said 1,000 things about narratives that there is to be said. And what's interesting is some of the guests that I've had on the show recently talking about the changes in worldview, from the traditionalist worldview to the modernity, post-modernity, and where we are right now in this kind of post-truth environment. There's a lot to be said for some of the psychology and underlying factors that have led to that. And again, we can dispute whether there was a driving force behind those things and who created that driving force, but nonetheless, it's something that's culturally unfolded, and politics is downstream from culture. And there is something in our culture right now that is becoming omnipresent in a way that is not necessarily useful for the future of humanity or the planet that we live in, which is why it is an imperative that we create a new story, because ultimately culture is shaped by the storylines that we create and the beliefs and the values that we hold. And many of those beliefs and values that people hold dear are being challenged. Some of them absolutely we need to preserve, but some we need to change. That's about preservation and conservation, but it's also about progression and advancing. It's not about left and right, it's about forward. Where do we go from here? So I invite you to join us tonight, 6:30 p.m. UK time. Links are in the comments above, in the description. Join me and David Charalambous. He's a behavioural expert, communications expert, who's been for the last 2 years just meticulously trying to understand, human behaviour during these times, and not only why people buy into narratives, but why we keep failing to break beyond our echo chambers and silos. The challenges we face when we try and simply share the data and the rational insights and expect people to change, and why we become addicted to doing that despite negative results. Tonight we're going to start looking at how we can break through some of those patterns and actually reach people. David's an expert in reaching people, and if there is no greater time in history than right now, in my opinion, that we need to get better at communicating, because ultimately, in order to create a new story, we have to be able to communicate that story, and we have to be able to communicate with each other, and to do so with respect and love and harmony, even when we disagree. So that's the challenge that's on the table. The reality is, if we're going to create solutions to the problems that we're facing, we can agree on some of the problems, but when it comes to the solutions, we bring our entire worldviews with us. There will be disagreements, but we can have healthy disagreements and we can find ways forward. That's really the opportunity that's available to us. So tonight, the session with David is really going to be about how and why this is manifesting psychologically, the communication principles behind it, why some of people's attempts to help people understand the issues are breaking down, and ultimately try and help people understand how we can better communicate information in order to get a better and deeper and shared sense of understanding of the issues of our time. Because without that, we're living by the narrative, and the narrative wins. It's time to break through that, and it's time to have better quality, sense-making conversations to get shared understanding. So join us tonight at 6:30. If you can't make it, don't worry, it's going to be recorded. I'm going to put it out live on the podcast tomorrow as a replay. But if you join us live tonight, 6:30 p.m, you'll get a taste of some of the events that we put on the Elevate Network. Our members get access to conversations like this every single month. Tonight's event is absolutely free. It's going to be a really compelling session. You'll have the opportunity to ask questions and join the discussion. The link is above or below, depending on where you're watching this. So sign up for the session tonight and come and join us in the Zoom room from 6:30 to 8 and take part in the conversation. All right, enjoy the rest of your day. I got to go get stuff done. Peace.